Welcome to our continuing coverage here on CNN News 18. What a moment this is. The Prime Minister a short while ago arriving at the Palam airport to receive his friend Vladimir Putin, the Russian president, both of them riding in the same car, and they've now reached the Prime Minister's residence at 7 LKM, where there will be a private dinner that the Prime Minister will be hosting for the Russian president. And more importantly, there will be, of course, the restricted meetings that will happen as well. So after which the president will go to the ITC Moria where he's staying, and then tomorrow is the business end of his visit. Let's just bring you up to speed with the images that we've seen already. Just about 30 minutes or so after President Putin touched down, Prime Minister broke protocol, went to the Palam airport to receive his friend. You can see him there at the tarmac, at the red carpet, welcoming President Putin. The Kremlin says they had no idea that Prime Minister Modi was coming to receive President Putin. Both of them, it's a warm hug, a warm embrace, and then they walk down that red carpet, and both men then, of course, share the same car. It is an Indian car. It is part of the security protocol team for the Prime Minister. Both of them took a moment to try and savor the Indian cultural performance. There was a troupe of women dancers performing the Bharatanatyam, so that happened. They took a few moments to savor that in, and then thereafter, both Prime Minister Modi and President Putin walk up to this car, this security cavalcade car that's part of the Prime Minister's security protocol. Both of them ride in that same car and head towards 7 LKM, the Prime Minister's residence, where, of course, the Prime Minister is hosting the Russian president, the visiting head of state, in a private dinner followed by restricted talks. And then President Putin leaves for the ITC Moria, where he's staying at the presidential suite for the next 24 hours. So these pictures from the Palam airport. In a few moments, we will get the pictures from 7 LKM as well, where the Prime Minister is hosting the visiting dignitary, the visiting head of state, the president of Russia. Clearly, this is a big moment as far as both India and Russia are concerned, because it comes at a moment of extreme geopolitical flux, at a time of geopolitical rebalancing, if you will, as far as both India and Russia are concerned. The Trump tariffs on India for importing Russian oil have really upended the relationship between India and the United States. It's also upended India's traditional relationship with Russia. Why Russia and India click? I think that's an important one to look at, because Russia supported India all through the Cold War, particularly in the 1971 war, in the liberation of Bangladesh. Kashmir vetoes. Every time Kashmir has come up at the United Nations Security Council, it has always been Russia that has backed India. There are defense routes. Remember, more than 50% of India's defense inventory, even today, even after diversification, even after Atmanirbharta, more than 50% of India's defense inventory is Russian origin, whether it's your tanks, your fighter jets, your missile defense systems. There's also old civilizational ties. Both the countries have had independent worldviews. India prides itself for its strategic autonomy, and Russia, of course, is looking at a non-American-led world order. Both sides have also held long memories of Western pressure, Western sanctions, Western hegemony. The last time, in fact, the first time President Putin was here and they started the annual summits, India was still under sanctions, under the nuclear test sanctions imposed by the United States. Now Russia is under sanctions, and also India is facing the tariffs. Discounted Russian oil, that has been a critical aspect of this relationship in the last 3 years since the Ukraine war began. Russia is India's number one energy supplier, number one oil supplier, and that is a factor. India is also a major ally for Russia beyond Beijing. Remember, President Putin said this, his press secretary said this. They want to have the same no-limits partnership that they have with China. They want to have the same thing with India. Are there limits, though, to this Russia, India, China trilateral, as it were? We will wait and try and see what will happen over the next 24 hours to try and assess whether or not that's possible. But I want to open this up to our guests. What can we expect over the next day, the next 30 hours or so? Vivek Kajju is former secretary in the Ministry of External Affairs, will be joined in a moment by Mukesh Aghi of the US-India Strategic Partnership Forum. Sadanand Dhume from the American Enterprise Institute will also be joining us, and Tatiana Kukureva is a senior Russian journalist who will be joining us from Moscow. But let me start with you, Ambassador Kajju. Like I said, this is a time of delicate strategic balancing that's going on. There is this great power competition between America, Russia, there's China as a rising power. How does India maintain this balance between Russia and America? Let's start there.
To be maintained between India and China. Russia is no longer the power that it was during the era of the Soviet Union. Let's be clear on that. We have an intense relationship with Russia, which we need to protect. That relationship is in the civil nuclear area, in space, in defense supplies. But beyond that, Russia is a power that has severe limitations, and that those limitations have increased because of its involvement in the Ukraine war. That war has shown both Russia's advantages, but equally its limitations. So we've got to be conscious of this.
Okay.
It is a time of balancing, and why is this balancing needed? This balancing is needed because this year has not been a particularly good year for the India-US relationship.
Correct.
I don't need to go into details. Please recall that it was in February of this year that Prime Minister Modi was one of the first foreign leaders to meet with President Trump. And there was great expectation in Delhi that the India-US relationship will move ahead rapidly on an upward trajectory. That has not happened. So, therefore, India has had to recalibrate its diplomacy, its foreign policy to a large extent. And
Okay.
what we are seeing today is a product of that recalibration. So, my last point, Zaka, is so the days when Mr. Modi sought to lecture President Putin, if you recollect, that was in September of 2022 on the margins of the SCO summit when he said publicly that this is not a time for war.
Okay.
I think that era has gone, and India has had to will have to play a far more delicate game, diplomatic game. But let us also be clear on one point.
So just 1 second, because we have a live link with the CNN reporter Will Ripley, who is in Delhi and will be covering this visit of President Putin over the next day or so. Will, thank you very much for joining us here on News 18. A lot is on the agenda for both President Putin and Prime Minister Modi. There's trade, defense deals, mobility agreements that people are talking about. What, at the end of the day, do you reckon would be the tangible results that we can expect at the end of the day of negotiations tomorrow?
Well, we already know that the two of them are going to be inking a lot of deals, trying to find ways to bolster the economic partnership, the long-standing friendship between India and Russia. But I think what's perhaps even more important than that for both of these men, for Modi and for Putin, is the optics of this. The fact that we saw them once again just moments ago sitting in a limousine together, much like they did several months ago after the SCO summit in China, where they sat and talked privately for nearly an hour in Putin's armored limousine. We saw Prime Minister Narendra Modi waiting on the tarmac to greet Vladimir Putin as he walked off the plane. They are likely doing this, projecting this close relationship, knowing that there's one person in particular glued to the television set watching this very closely. And of course, you and I both know who that is. That's President Donald Trump at the White House. This is coming at a very critical time where relations between Delhi and New Delhi and Washington are arguably at some of the lowest levels in years. At the same time, Russia and the U.S. are trying to figure out a way to negotiate an end to the war in Ukraine. And for Vladimir Putin to be able to come here and stand next to the leader of the world's largest democracy, one of the most powerful leaders in the world, and to stand shoulder to shoulder and project such warmth and friendship, it's a message to Donald Trump, for both Modi and Putin, that they have options no matter what happens with the U.S.
How do you think Washington, and in particular the Trump administration, how do you think they're going to view this? The last time, like you said, when they rode together at the SCO summit, I think Trump said something on social media to the effect that I think we've lost India to deep, dark China and Russia. How do you think he's going to view it this time around?
Well, I think it's, of course, I don't know President Trump personally, but from what we see publicly and what he says, he might get pretty jealous to see the two of them so close and chatting so in such a friendly way. President Trump loves himself to sit in the limousine and chat with Prime Minister Modi and to sit with Vladimir Putin. He likes to be in the room when these conversations are happening. And so the fact that he is kind of on the outside looking into this, that's not a great position for him to be in, because he needs things from both Modi and Putin. He wants to end very badly the war in Ukraine. The Russians feel that, frankly, they have a lot more leverage in this situation, which leaves the United States to basically do the easier thing and to pressure the Ukrainians to threaten weapons shipments and intelligence sharing and that sort of thing. There's not a whole lot of pressure that the U.S. can put on Russia right now because the sanctions aren't really working that much. Putin's kind of rejiggered his economy to make it an economy that is supported by this war effort. So the Russians can keep waging war as long as they feel they need to, until they get things like the concessions, the land concessions of the Donbass region. And so for President Trump to be watching that and to know that he doesn't have a whole lot of economic leverage either, because of the fact that India is purchasing so much affordable Russian oil, the economic relationship, the military technology, the fighter jet, information sharing that could be negotiated and signed here in the coming hours. All of it certainly leaves President Trump sitting in the White House wondering what he's going to need to do to get himself in the position that he likes, which is a more powerful position than perhaps the United States is sitting in right now.
Okay, Will Ripley, many thanks for joining us live covering the visit of President Putin to Delhi. Of course, both of them have now arrived at the Prime Minister's residence, where a private dinner is being hosted by the Prime Minister for the visiting president. Let me also go across and open this up to our panelists. Mukesh Aghi from US-India Strategic Partnership Forum. He's joining us. Tatiana Kukreva is a senior Russian journalist. She's joining us as well, and we'll be joined in a moment by Sazanand Dhume from the American Enterprise Institute. Mr. Aghi, let me start with you. I mean, clearly the backdrop to this entire visit, some would say, the elephant in the room when President Putin and Prime Minister Modi speak will be President Donald Trump. And much of the conversation, I guess, would revolve around India's import of Russian oil, the 50% tariffs that the US has imposed on India. How does India play this delicate balancing act? All right, we're just getting the latest shots from 7 LKM, where both leaders have arrived just moments ago. You can see both of them walk down that red carpet. You've got the Russian flag on the one side, the Indian flag on the other side, and both of them walking in to 7 LKM, which is lit up in the colors of the tricolor and the three colors of the Russian flag, the red, white and blue of the Russian flag and the saffron, white and green of the Indian flag. Both Prime Minister Modi and President Putin getting off that luxury vehicle, walking down the red carpet and going in to 7 LKM, where the Prime Minister is hosting a private dinner for the visiting President of Russia, President Vladimir Putin. As we stay on those pictures, I want to bring in Mukesh Aghi on this note. How will this be viewed in the White House by President Trump? And again, how does India strategically balance its interests at the same time not having to antagonize President Trump?
Well, Zaka, first is when you look at the current situation between India and the US, it is driven more by the US in the current scenario. The second part is the relationship is not just about tariff between the two countries. I think relationship is much broader and deeper. So I think the tariff issue, if you just park aside, we're seeing the trade still moving forward. The students are still coming in. The technology transfer is happening. So that's I would like to say that please let's not focus just on tariff. The relationship is much, much broader. How is this being viewed? I think you have a prime minister who has basically managed this very, very carefully, because you have a country, Russia, which has been with India for many, many years and supported India in every aspect. But at the same time, it's a country which is diminishing power, and economy is in a challenging position, whereas India's largest trading partner is the United States. If you look at the majority of the capital is coming from the U.S. companies. When you look at in the aspect of technology transfer, it's coming more from the U.S. When you look at the global capability centers in India, almost 2,000, 60% are U.S. and creating a lot of innovation in every aspect. So the relationship with the U.S. is still very important, very critical, and it will keep on moving forward. I think the shock of the 50% tariff is gone. India has managed that very well. It has been able to divert a lot of the exports from US to other countries. So I think that leverage which US had has kind of dwindled down substantially. So I would say that while Russian president was coming in, we saw a couple of orders on defense deal that the US announced. They're sending a message to the US also saying that the relationship is very important. We will maintain our relationship with our friends, be it China, be it Russia, or be it European Union. So I think from every aspect, India is playing a very strong role as trying to manage a multilateral relationship between different countries.
I also want to go across to Tatiana, and both Mr. Aghi and Ambassador Kaju before him, one running theme had been, look, Russia is not the power that it used to be. Yes, India has had a long-standing relationship with Russia, even with the Soviet Union, on the defense front, on other fronts, but it is a diminishing power. It is a declining power. How do you see that?
Well, I don't quite agree with that, understandably. If anything, our economy has shown its incredible resilience because, for almost 4 years now, I've heard this. We've heard this every year saying, okay, your economy is going to collapse. You're not going to survive this. And yet here we are. And our economy has actually not just not collapsed, like some of the European countries who are experiencing huge economic troubles due to the sanctions that were originally imposed on Russia. So the fact that we've managed to regroup, restructure the economy shows that Russia is not only a huge power that needs to be taken seriously, because again, we can't just stick to the same narrative of, oh, look, well, Russia's under sanctions, it's struggling, and it's not going to be the same power it used to be. Yes, of course, the Soviet Union was quite a different story. But look at, and first of all, I mean, we need to look at what is on the table for this visit. Russia has been involved, for instance, in the nuclear industry with India since 2002, if I'm not mistaken. And right now, Russia is at the forefront of technology when it comes to small modular reactors. This is not going to change. Our defense production is obviously a hugely successful field. And as I think I've already said today, the advantage of Russian defense technology is that it is actually tested in operational capacity. So there are a lot of things that can be discussed. There's a lot of diversification to this relationship that is on the table during this visit. And I believe that, the whole idea of Russia being the underdog here is not at all correct, and it shouldn't.
Okay.
So we should look at things from a different perspective.
So I think Tatiana is right. I mean, tomorrow when the leaders discuss, when they get to the business end of the business day, really, they will be talking about diversification of this relationship. I believe there's something about labor mobility that they will announce tomorrow. There's going to be something about import of fertilizers from Russia. So they're trying to diversify the breadth of this relationship. Sadanand Dhume, senior fellow with the American Enterprise Institute, is also joining us. Sadanand, so, just before you joined, I was making this point both to Mr. Aghi and to Ambassador Kaju that, look, if Trump thought that he could pressurize India with the oil tariffs and get India to put pressure on Mr. Putin to stop the war, that hasn't happened. And if his view was that India will sort of fold and stop importing Russian oil, that hasn't happened either. So how is this visit being viewed in Washington, and this whole strategy of putting those oil tariffs on India, both in terms of what impact it would have on Russia and what impact it would have on India, doesn't seem to have played out, at least the way Mr. Trump thought it would?
Thank you, Zaka. I'm not, my own view, I spent some time pondering this. It's not clear to me how linked those two things were in Mr. Trump's mind. Because on the one hand, you have the fact that he imposed this 25% extra tariff on India. But in terms of US-Russia policy, it seems to kind of blow one way and then the other way. So on the one hand, you have had this sort of attempt to pressure Russia, ironically through India as opposed to sort of directly. But on the other hand, if you look at US policy towards Russia, I think the US appears to be far more eager to beat out some kind of peace deal between Russia and Ukraine. We've had multiple meetings between Special Envoy Witkoff and President Putin, for example. And so I'm not sure if this was all sort of part of this finely coordinated, finely tuned issue. I think what's happened on the tariffs, at least in part, is that that's just Trump's style of negotiating. It tends to be punitive. He tends to try to raise the stakes. And I think he saw a lever on India on the trade stuff, which was related to Russia, which was sort of, maybe connected somewhat to his larger plans in Russia. But I think the trade dispute is at least in my mind, it's a separate strand of policy here.
Ambassador Kaju, just in terms of, clearly Trump wants to end this war. And even earlier this week, Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner were in Russia. Mr. Putin doesn't seem to be in any mind to end this war. He wants to win this war on the battlefield, and he thinks that he's winning the war on the battlefield. But the problem is also those oil tariffs are not going to go away till this war ends. So whether India likes it or not, India has skin in this game. So how does India manage it then, Ambassador?
Look, India has wanted the war to end no sooner had it begun. There's no doubt about it. India wants this war to end. I think it's in India's interest that this war ends quickly. But anyone in Delhi who believes that India has leverage over Russia and can contribute to ending this war would be in cuckoo land. I don't think we really have any leverage over Russia on this. This is a European matter for Russia. It's a Western matter. And the Russians have gained substantially on the battlefield. Trump understands that. The Europeans are still hung up on sovereignty issues. And Putin has an advantage here. He can wait it out for quite some time. I think his economy has held. So that is one aspect. The second is that I do not believe that the tariffs have not hurt us. The tariffs have been in labor-intensive industries. There have been layoffs. And while we have tried to look for other markets, there are areas like textiles, like carpets, etc., where there is no substitute for the American market. So the tariffs have hurt. And Modi would like the tariffs to become more reasonable. Certainly, he would like the 25% based on Russian oil exports, that portion of the tariffs to be history, but that's not happening.
Yeah.
So I think the signal that Mr. Modi is sending to Washington, particularly to Mr. Trump, is that India has alternatives, that India can play the grand strategy game and will not be pressurized by the Americans.
Okay.
The fact is that what is the ambit of play that we have here? On that, we can have a discussion till the cows come home and not arrive at a definite consensus.
Okay.
But my last point, we are hurting. On that, let there be no doubt. Despite all the signaling that is being sent to Washington, we are hurting because of tariffs.
So Mr. Aghi, the problem here is that Trump has undertaken a strategy. I'm not sure the results are paying off. And two, by taking the actions he has taken, he's only pushing India further and further into Russia's embrace. In fact, just before he arrived here, President Putin and his press secretary basically said that we want to have the same kind of relationship with India that we have with China. Now, you could argue that it's not possible because of all kinds of reasons, but at least in the Russian thinking, in the Russian point of view, they want to have the same relationship, the same no-limits partnership that they have with Beijing. They want to extend that to India as well. And some would say, why shouldn't India take that hand of friendship? Because after all, Trump is pushing us in that direction.
Well, I would not basically measure the relationship India has with the U.S. vis-a-vis Russia or China, because the relationship is much broader, much deeper. You have around 5+ billion Indian Americans who basically are quite engaged in the economic, social environment, technology environment, academia, and they work very closely either from emotional attachment or economic attachment with India. When you look at the corporate America, and I've talked to roughly 80 plus global CEOs in the last 30 days, not a single one has said that they will move the investment out of India, or they will move their supply chain out of India, or they will shorten their investment in their global capability centers. So I think you have to understand the relationship between the United States and India is very, very different than with Russia or with China. I mean, so with Russia, it's more on a commodity base. You know, you're basically getting oil or you're getting other commodities itself. As far as trade goes, I mean, India's export to Russia is less than $5 billion. Whereas with the US and India is over $200 billion two-way trade itself. So I think the relationship is very, very different, very solid. Yes, tariffs are hurting, but I think the relationship is just not just based on tariff. And I think last quarter GDP results showed tariff or no tariff, India's economy grew by 8.2%.
Tatiana, you know, one of the points that a lot of guests have made, and I think what Mr. Aghi was also trying to allude to, is that the relationship between India and Russia basically has two legs. One is the defense relationship, which is an old one. I mean, even today, despite diversification, despite, you know, Atmanirbharta or self-reliance for defense manufacturing, more than 50% of India's weapons inventory has a Russian origin. So that's a long-standing one. And the other leg now, particularly since this war began, is on the energy side, with India importing a lot of Russian oil. But beyond that, you know, whether it is people-to-people contact, and I was looking at it, there are 70,000 Indians who are living and working in Russia right now. There are 5 million Indian Americans. The breadth of this relationship is very limited. It's very thin.
Well, this is exactly what is being looked at in terms of diversification, including during this visit. You know that the State Duma has just ratified the agreement that basically lays the foundation for many things, a legal foundation for including the labor, logistics, but not limited to that. And you know, however, it doesn't. However small it feels, but like for instance, in central Moscow, where I'm right now, it feels like we've had a lot more tourism from India. There is this connection between the people of Russia and India that has been there for decades. I mean, there is a cultural connection. I've had the pleasure of meeting Mr. Adil Hussein this year and in Moscow, and we spoke of Russian literature and the influence it's had on Indian cinema to begin with. But there's a huge history between our two nations. So to diminish it all to the level of the relationship being stood on, as you say, on two legs of defense exports and energy trade, also even diminishing that to the fact that India literally saved the economies of European nations, even of the US to some extent, by continuing to buy Russian oil and by stopping the oil prices from rocketing sky high back in 2022. It is a little bit too black and white to my taste.
Okay.
Even, yeah.
So Sadanand, you know, the strategic logic in the last 20, 25 years, which underpinned the India-US relationship was, you know, if there's one country that can challenge US primacy, it is China. Somehow Trump seems to have, you know, thrown that logic out the window. He's very keen to cut a deal with Xi Jinping. They even had a phone call, I think, a few days ago when this whole tensions between China and Japan were ratcheting up over Taiwan. He seems keen that he doesn't want to sort of intrude in what he sees as Beijing's sphere of influence or Xi Jinping's sphere of influence. As far as India is concerned, we've had our own history with China, but relations seem to be on the mend. And now Russia is basically saying that we want to have the same relationship with India that we have with China. And there are also concerns that because of the war, effectively one of the consequences of this war has been that Russia has been pushed further and further into Beijing's embrace. That's something that the Russians are also concerned about, and certainly it's something that concerns folks here in New Delhi.
See, Zach, the way I see it, like even if you sort of, for a moment take I will come to the US part of your question, but even if you take the US out of the equation for a second and pretend that we were having this conversation, let's say in April this year, when US-India relations looked really strong, looked to be on an upswing, Vice President J.D. Vance was in New Delhi and so on, right? Even at that moment, if we'd had a discussion about the India-Russia relationship, I agree with Tatiana that there's great sentiment. There's a certain amount of, there are cultural links, certainly going back to the, to the Soviet era, where Moscow was quite, sophisticated in terms of how it reached out to India and Indian elites and so on. So there's a sentimental element that's certainly there. But if you sort of go beyond that, right? The energy spike only dates to 2022. Before 2022, India had, the amount of energy India imported from Russia was vanishingly small. It was just less than a percent. And then you have the arms industry, which has been very important, as you pointed out. 50% still matters. But again, there, if you look at the CIPRI data, it has come down dramatically, right? India has gone from basically being, having roughly 70% of Indian arms imports being of Russian origin to the last 5-year period I looked at, it was down to 35%. Still number one, but to go from 70% to 35% is a very dramatic decline. So what we had until this recent kerfuffle with the US was a strong relationship. Nobody ever thought that India was going to cut its ties with Russia. India has a strong independent relationship with Russia that goes back for decades. It's been mutually reinforced. But the larger strategic dilemma remains, which is that if you look at Eurasia, the economic map of Eurasia has changed very dramatically over the last 25 years. And China has been the big gainer. India has been the second big gainer. And Russia, though it may not be collapsing, is really not in the picture. And so what India finds itself is that it has a China problem with Russia, whether it likes it or not. Now, ideally, from an Indian perspective, the US would be engaged in great power competition. It would view China as its major adversary or rival, and that would continue to be something that drives US-India relations closer.
Okay.
We have an idiosyncratic president in the White House right now who appears to have abandoned that, and that has created all kinds of chaos in the US-India relationship. But India's questions about the Russia-China relationship and Russia-China closeness and Russia dependency on China, those predate this current kerfuffle with India, and those aren't going away because they're based on very strong numbers. The fact is that the Chinese economy is vastly larger than the Russian economy. And the fact is that since 2022, Russia has become much more dependent on China. I'm not blaming anybody. I'm just saying this is just a reality. Mm-hmm. And this raises questions for India. It raises questions for Indian defense planners. How much could it rely on Russia in a crunch?
All right, just one final word. I'm really out of time. Ambassador Kachu, you are putting a hand up, so just one sentence, please. What is it?
Just one sentence,
yeah, please,
Zaka.
please.
I think there is a personal angle, and we know that these great leaders today, President Trump, Prime Minister Modi, President Putin, and Xi Jinping, lay a great deal of emphasis on personal chemistry. I think Trump's actions have deeply embarrassed Prime Minister Modi. And what we are seeing today, which is a good thing for the India-Russia relationship, I'm all in favor of the strengthening of this relationship. But let us not forget that there are personal signals being sent out by Mr. Modi to President Trump.
Okay. All right, we'll leave it at that. Thank you very much, Ambassador Kaju, Susanna Dhume, and Mr. Mukesh Aghi. Thank you very much indeed for joining us here on this special coverage.